There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean, the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another of my ongoing series of chats with the Saskatchewan writer David Carpenter, or should I say the incandescent David Carpenter.
Oh, I love that. 4 syllables, wow.
How are you doing today, Dave?
I'm doing very well, thanks.
It's great to be back doing this series of chats with you. Today we're going to talk about either Dave's first work of published fiction or his second. They all came out around the same time.
That's right, yes.
This one in Jewels, but this one is Jokes for the Apocalypse. Came out in 1985. And the first question I have for you is, this is an unusual form for a work of fiction. I have read and loved many short story cycles where the short stories were linked, and I've read many collections where there's one novella and a bunch of short stories, and I've read series of novels, but I've never read work of fiction that were two interconnected novellas. So I'd love to hear from the point of view of structure how that came to be.
It started back around, I would say, maybe 1980, 81, and I wrote the title story, Jokes for the Apocalypse, and sent it off to Colin and Stewart. Jack McClellan had asked me to send something because he'd read my stuff in Saturday Night. So I sent him this, and he drooled over it. He really loved it. I had sent them a terrible manuscript before that they didn't publish. But we won't talk about that.
We won't.
Every novelist has a first novel.
Absolutely.
Anyway, he loved it, and he says, too short, we need another novella before we can make this into a book. So go forth and write one. So I didn't have a structure in mind at that time, but I often thought about the characters in Jokes for the Apocalypse, especially Ham Walmsley, the main character, the alcoholic. Why is he uncomfortable in the world? Why does he drink? What is the unquenchable thing he's trying to drown out? And there seemed to me one of the things he didn't have when I imagined his childhood was he didn't have a father. And when I finished this and started on Loose, the second novella I wrote, I found a character there who could have died in his prime, abandoning his family. His name was also Walmsley. And that was that little link that I provided for the two novellas. And I think that both novellas look at death and tragedy. One of them in a more deeply felt way, that would be Jokes for the Apocalypse. And then Loose also goes back into the past to discover something dark about death.
Absolutely.
So they're more thematically linked than strategically linked.
And interesting that you wrote Jokes for the Apocalypse, the title novella first. It comes second in the volume, and then you wrote Loose. Let's talk about Loose in a little bit of depth. It's dedicated to Peter Carpenter. Can you tell us about who that is and why you dedicated it to him? I assume it's a relative.
Yes. He is my brother. There were just the two of us as kids, and he had experienced life at this little cottage we rented in the summer when we were moving into our early teens. And it was a lake called Lake Wabamun west of Edmonton, and it was a beach called Capasquan Beach. There were no Wendigos around there. And it was also right next to an indigenous reservation. And he and I had a lot of fun there. We had a lot of fun playing games. And once in a while, he was the older brother, once in a while he would even let me play with his older friends. That was a rare occasion, but it was much appreciated. Anyhow, that lake was so evocative for me. The memories there were so evocative that I could probably write something set there and explore that part of my youth. So there are a few things in Loose that actually did happen.
Come from life.
And there are characters in Loose that remind me of people that I grew up with.
And are they all dead now?
I hope so.
So we can get into the weeds with that?
No, I don't hope they're dead. But I found that where I lived and where I went to school, right up to about the age of 14, there was one side of my neighborhood that was really wealthy. Some of it was old money, English families, old money. And if you went to, let's see, north of there, the other edge was tough. It was rough, and there was a lot of fights in my school. And this novella, I think, looks at working class people, and it looks at upper middle class people, and just plain middle class people. I didn't set out thinking that way, but I think I discovered after I'd written it that I had covered, socially speaking, I had covered that.
Socioeconomic.
Yeah, but that doesn't really tell you where this story came from.
So tell us where it came from.
Gosh, where do I begin? I remember meeting my first indigenous people, old people, most of them, on occasional visits to and from the reserve, or on the same road we'd walk along. And I remember people talking about a really big fish that they'd seen coming close to shore when the ice was receding. And I once saw an enormous northern pike, jackfish we'd call them, and it was a massive fish. It would have been 4 feet long. It was caught through the ice. It's too bad the guys kept it, because an old spawner like that should be returned. Anyhow, I looked at it with great awe. I remember that. And anyway, I had already created the character Drew Edmond and stuck him in a story called Protection for Saturday night. And I chose Drew Edmond to be my sort of center of consciousness as the story unfolds. He's telling us the story of his youth. He's telling the contemporary story of his marriage. He's casting himself back into the early times when he learned about everything for the first time. And then I paid a visit out to my mom and dad's place on the West Coast. And every morning I asked them, could you please just leave me alone, and then I'll be your son from noon onwards. And it made them very curious. And that's because this story was starting to unfold. And what Edmund remembers was in his middle-class home, his parents were very watchful and he was very safe. And he couldn't stand that. He didn't like the fact that his parents were so doting and careful with the boys and make sure they didn't get lost in the woods and things like that. So I guess I started writing about that annoyance, and instead of plotting loose this 90-page story, it started to unfold by itself, and it was a remarkable experience for a young writer not to know what he's going to finish up with, finding this story unfold, each of the characters and each of the situations. And maybe the only inevitable thing about that is that it would be set at the lake in the summer. It would be a story of a middle-class kid who learns really about the source of his family. He learns about when his sister was conceived and under which circumstances.
Yes.
And he learns things about fear and courage and how mysterious people can be. At the end of it, when I'd finished writing it, I thought that if I can just be really careful and rewrite it and all that sort of stuff, I think that McCollum Stewart would probably like this one too. And it's one of those rare occasions in my writing career where I sent them a novella, they adored it. I sent in this loose, they adored it. They assigned me to an editor, and although there was a lot of editorial help, I have to say, especially in the case of the first novella, Jokes for the Apocalypse, but it was really quick and easy, and I lived with this illusion that writing must be kind
of... always be like that.
Yeah, sure. At the same time, I was writing Jules, too, and Jules overlaps a little bit with the two novellas, and it was longer. It was pronounced a novel rather than a novella, and I sent it to another Toronto publisher shortly after that. So In 1985, when my wife and I, Honor and I, came to Toronto, I launched both books at once,
Oh, for
Jules
God's
and
sakes.
Jokes of the Apocalypse. And people thought that this guy must just churn them out one a month.
Joyce Carol Oates.
Yeah, that's right. But it took a long time before all three of those Jules, Jokes of the Apocalypse, and Loose got finished. But it was fun to launch two at the same.
Holy smokes.
Yeah.
And really 3 works of fiction.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to chatting with you about Jules next time. Before I ask you to read the opening of Loose, tell us about the Wendigo spirit.
Yeah, I had always heard about and read about the presence of Wendigos in, the Northern Cree imagination. And certainly a rather large diversity of Northern Indigenous people had either the Wendigo or the Witigo or the equivalent of that. And it came out of their imaginations. And this is pure speculation. Please don't mistake me for somebody who really knows what he's saying. But in places where the winters are very hard and food sources are very hard to find, the fear of starvation was an ongoing thing, the threat of starvation, shall we say. And one of the solutions to starvation is to resort to cannibalism. And I have no idea how often that happened, but I have read authorities talk about the fear of cannibalism. And Witigo, or the Wendigo, was a kind of mythic archetype, an embodiment of that fear. And as I was told by a native man that I got to know quite well, that sometimes, he said, his mother, or it might have been his grandmother, said that if you don't behave yourself and go to sleep early, the Wendigo will get you. Yeah, so it's very much alive in the Northern imagination, and I use that myth here.
And so, if you did commit cannibalism, what did the Wendigo do? Kill you, or?
I think that there would be some kind of terrible vengeance.
Yeah.
But instead of telling stories about cannibalism, they told stories about Witigo. And it seemed to be the perfect horror story for people growing up in small settlements up north, where they had to be very canny, very lucky, very wood-wise to survive.
Very malevolent, very vengeful, scary being.
Right,
You didn't want to offend. Great. Can you read the opening section of Loose?
Sure. In the winter of 1936, my father's plane went down on a vast lake somewhere north of Whitehorse. There were 3 in the plane. The pilot was a man named Walmsley. He was badly hurt on impact when the plane skidded across the lake and crashed into a snow-covered rock on the shore of a small island. Apparently this man died a day or 2 later. This left father and a Cree Indian named Amos Whitehawk, who had survived with my father for several months. Both escaped from the plane with a few cuts and bruises. My father knew very little about survival in the bush, so at this point Amos took charge of things. They made a provisional sort of igloo by scooping snow all night long into a large hump, letting it harden, then digging inward and upward to clear out a chamber about 7 feet across and 4 feet high. The chamber was above the level of the entrance, so the heat generated by their bodies stayed in. On extremely cold nights, they would sometimes let a candle burn, so the temperature of their little igloo remained somewhat above freezing. They had a .22 rifle, some tins of sardines, and some cocoa. The bush plane remained in full view by their igloo on the leeward side of the little island. After each snowfall, they made a point of sweeping off the entire plane so the searchers would be able to spot it. The one thing Father remembered best about his conversations with Amos during their 53-day ordeal was what he said about Regina, his sweetheart. The longer they remained stranded up there, the more Amos extolled her in his quiet way, until this woman, whom Father had never met, gradually became synonymous with warm houses, home-cooked meals, affection, hot tea, feather beds, everything civilized, everything that was not bush. By a process I can only describe as religious, she became the home to which their minds returned each night when there was nothing left to eat and nothing visible to hope for. Eventually their plane was spotted from the air, their position relayed by radio, and they were rescued by some men with dog sleds. They arrived in Whitehorse in reasonable health and became celebrities overnight. Their story was reported and broadcast from coast to coast.
And so set the scene of how the novel opens from there, just to give us more of a taste of how this novella, I should say, Loose, goes from there.
I guess once I've given you that introduction, our narrator, Drew Edmond, talks about Amos. They didn't have a lot to talk, his parents and Amos and Regina. They didn't have a lot in common, but instead of becoming closer and buddies, they worshipped Amos and Regina as more perfect than human.
Right. Absolutely.
And so the kids from that family, Drew and his brother Hank, and the sister Regina, who's named after the great Regina up north, they want to find out more about their parents, more about their own circumstances, their birth. And so Drew, who's a journalist, keeps telling this is what happened, and then Hank tells the other story, and Regina doesn't know who to believe, and she suggests that he write it all down. And then instead of writing the story down, Drew talks about a strange dream he had. And this gets him into the dream world and gets him writing. The beginning of his actual writing of this story takes place, part 2 on page 16, when he writes, "One summer when I was 12, Butch Bulmer told me that old Mr. Hook was a fruit." And that is the beginning of his long memoir.
And so I can't remember now how often it jumps back and forth from present time with Drew as an adult and to the childhood memories, but it's mostly focused on the summer of, was it 1953?
Yeah.
It certainly goes back and forth.
Yeah,
and
several times.
Times. And in the present of the story, Drew is in the midst of kind of a marital breakdown, or that's how it first appears.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's a marriage that might be turning a little somnolent, and Rachel is not entirely pleased with her husband Drew's inward way of living. He's more obsessed with his story than his life, and she says things to him that challenge him to give her more freedom, and he's really scared about that. And then by the end of the novella, it looks as though Rachel and Edmund are maybe on the verge of returning to each other.
Which is a nice echo of the title story.
Yeah.
If I had to pick one character that I'd like you to tell us about Queenie Bothwell.
Queenie Bothwell, yes. She has come from difficult circumstances and somehow managed to gentrify herself.
Yes.
Into somebody who's, as far as Edmund can stand it, high society. She's a very lovely woman who seems to think she's in the midst of a glorious 19th century romantic lifestyle. And she tries to raise her 2 daughters to be not only very beautiful, but ladies. They resent it, so they resent their mother, who's putting on airs. And Queenie also has a bit of a histrionic bent to her.
Just a bit.
Yeah. So when she and her husband decide to become Canadians, she wants to celebrate it in a way by having a great dinner out at the lake with her friends, including Drew Edmond's family. And she wants Canadians to know that she's really into Canadian literature, so she reads the Robert Service poem,
Cremation of
Sam McGee, to show that she's, culturally speaking, dead center. Look, and Queenie has a dark secret, and it isn't that dark of a secret, really, but she's ashamed of the fact that she was born Australian and she had to learn how to be British. And her father is an impossible old roue, a filthy man, really.
Mr. Hook.
Yeah, Mr. Hook, and he releases that secret. She says she was born a bloody Aussie, and she's terribly hurt by that.
It turned into the citizenship party from hell.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll leave the reader to hear more about the fish. And I'd like to, before we move on to the second novella, I'd like to read this short quote and have you riff on it. This is from near the end of Loose. Windigo, I thought, and only once, afraid I might invoke it. The hunger that curls back the lips of dogs and bears and men. The thing that gets in you because you've been hungry for too long.
Yeah, although Drew Edmond has had an easy life and a middle-class life, and he's had his challenges, he's never gone hungry. And yet, in that summer, when he discovers a fish known by Amos as the bad one, and he's discovered the hard scrabble life that the Bulmers have led, and he discovers a desperate kind of love where Freddie Bulmer is head over heels over this unapproachable, beautiful daughter named Miranda. And there's a hunger there. In fact, I think the novel is a sort of symphonic riff on hunger. Hunger of all kinds, life in the extreme. And so, in a second-hand kind of fashion, this is what Drew Edmond learns about. And I think Windigo is a nice little symbol of what's going on there.
So let's move to an even hungrier protagonist in the title novella, Jokes for the Apocalypse.
Very thirsty, too.
Very thirsty, I would say, more than hungry, although there's many kinds of hunger. So you open this one with an epigraph from Ecclesiastes, chapter 11, verse 3. I thought in my heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly. That sets the tone.
Yeah.
This one is dedicated to Clifford Elliott. Is there a story you'd like to share about who he was or how he came to be the dedicatee?
This might take 2 or 3 minutes.
We got that time, absolutely.
When I was a kid, my parents made my brother and I go to church with them, and it was a kind of boring experience until we got this minister named Clifford Elliott, who was not only a learned man, not only a committed man, and a great orator. He became a kind of hero of mine. Everybody adored him, and he had a wonderful, progressive wife. And anyway, he disappeared from Edmonton. I didn't know where, and I grew up, and I wrote the first novella, which appears second in this book. Jokes for the Apocalypse is the name of the novella. And my parents, who had patiently waited for me to finish this work, were curious about it. And my mother said, why don't you show it to me now that you've finished the manuscript? And something in me said, gosh, I don't want to do this because there's some street language there. And they might. But I thought, oh, what the hell? And I gave it to her, and she read the whole novella through the night, and I came up in the morning from this basement suite they kept me in, and I said, well, what did you think? And she spoke out of the side of her mouth. She said, wait till your father is out of the house. And I thought, oh, geez, I'm in for it. And she said to me, if you publish this work of fiction, I would go to the windows. I would turn down the blinds so nobody could see into our house, and your father would just die. So I had my various complaints about my parents, but they were good people, and I didn't want to be their murderer. Anyway, I told this story to Angie Migalski, and she got angry with me. She said, David, you have no right to give your mother your story. Your mother, you must realize she wants to murder you. So we got all Freudian about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, my mom and I had a long argument, and it was a fruitful argument. It wasn't as angry as it was intense. And I finally said to her, look, if I could find a third person to read this novella, somebody you would trust, somebody I would trust, to make a judgment on it as to whether it's pornographic, would you abide by that decision? And she says, what one of my friends would you trust and what one of your friends would I trust? And then I thought, I had an inspiration. I thought, what if I could find Clifford Elliott? He's not only a really good minister, but he's a very well-read person. He knows a lot of literature. And she said, you'll never find him. It took me a while, but I did find him. I came back to Mom and I said, look, I've found Clifford Elliott. By then I was living in Toronto, so was Clifford. And I've sent him my novella. And she was embarrassed because she didn't want Clifford Elliott to know what kind of a son she had raised who had read a story like this. Clifford Elliott did me a great favor. He read the whole...
Both of them?
Both of them, but with special attention to Jokes for the Apocalypse. The one that has, if your listeners don't mind, has a little bit of sex in it.
Oh, yes.
And it has lots of street language. And he took a while to read it, and he wrote a letter to my mother saying that, first of all, he was very glad to have read the book. It's not pornographic by his lights. There's a lot of street language, and if I found my own children using that language, I'd be very concerned. I would really ream them out. But he said, I think it's a kind of a deeply disturbing and moral book at the same time. And I brought this letter to Mom. She read it. Next morning I came up. I said, what do you think? She said, just wait till your father goes out. And then she said, I guess you can publish that novella. So I went away with two hopes. First of all, I went away with the fact that I wasn't going to kill my mother and father by publishing this book. And secondly, I was very happy that she thought it might be publishable. She was a very good reader. Anyway, that's the trauma I had to go through before I could submit this.
Wow. That's an incredible story. Clifford Elliott, was he a United Church minister?
Yes. And
his name sounds familiar. I'm going to ask my mom. I think she might have known him.
Yeah, he was famous.
Yeah.
He was famous in two ways. He was the moderator for the United Church.
That's why.
But also, he was a peace activist during the 70s and 80s when the Russians were building up armaments and the Americans. It was an armament war, really. And he went over to Russia and talked with peace groups in Moscow, and he did a lot of very good work outside.
And he was a peace activist in the Carpenter family.
That's right. Very good. Yeah.
Why don't you read the opening of Jokes for the Apocalypse?
The first chapter of this novella is Lola. This morning, I woke up calling for my dog. I was a boy once more. A storm was coming, and everyone else was safe inside, but I wouldn't come in until Jokes was back from his morning prowl. Hunch was out there, too. Huge clouds were thundering in like a herd of horses, but I was adamant. Here, Jokes, I cried. Here, Joko! And Alice woke me up. Ham, she says, you're having another one of your nightmares. Which was not true. I wasn't screaming. I was just calling my dog. Alice simply said to justify her reproachful look. She'd come into her room dressed in her painter's smock. Her hair was combed out, face made up. This reproachful look has been carefully honed into a weapon over the years. It says to me, don't you see what you're doing to yourself? Drink all night? What do you expect? To sleep like a baby? I grumbled something, and she left me in the bedroom to face the morning. I poured myself a friendly, sat on the bed, and tried to summon Jokes into that part of my mind that wasn't still booming with timpanis and discord. His name was short for Joachim, which no one but my mother could pronounce. He'd been my best friend from boyhood till past puberty. A slobbery black lab who used to prowl for cats down our alley every morning of his life. He was a walking incinerator, perpetually hungry, gentle with ear-pulling children, indiscriminately loving with adults, fearless even among larger dogs, relentless among cats. He ate frozen turds, old shoes, garbage from the alleys, and even the occasional cat. He never had to defend any of us from danger, but I never doubted that he would have if he'd had to. The first girl I ever kissed told me I smelled like a trash can. It hurt me because I knew she was right. Though it was forbidden, I slept with Jokes as often as I could sneak him into my bedroom. When eventually I left town to study music, my mother had him put to sleep. I never forgave her.
So Jokes is a dog, and pets play a fairly major role in the stories.
Ham does live with a lot of cats.
That's the cat, of course. Yes.
He doesn't exactly welcome them into his life.
It's not a mutual admiration society, no.
Yeah, they were really Alice's cats, but they surrounded him for quite a while. And he had to do something about it after a while.
At the end, and that's quite a really powerful part of the story.
Yeah.
The ending, I thought, was just incredibly powerful. So that's a good introduction to Ham Walmsley. What else would you like to tell us about the first-person protagonist?
Yeah, I've been aware for some time that when I was a young guy, I read a lot of Faulkner and Hemingway, the usual guys. Oh, we have Malcolm Lowry. Most of them were American writers, and almost all of them were bad drunks. Oh, and James Joyce. I love James Joyce. Terrible drunk. And I often wondered what that was all about. Maybe these writers had reached a point in their lives when they could no longer live with any pleasant illusions. They had delved so deeply into the dark night of the soul, something like that. But I guess from that experience, I was attracted not only to these human wreckages, who were also geniuses, but to the drunk as a character. And I don't know how I came across the character of Ham Walmsley, except that as I was growing up in our neighborhood, there were several alcoholics, and maybe he hailed back to one of our neighbors or something like that. But I wanted to follow this guy, Ham, who's a kind of failed Abraham figure, I guess you could say, through his life. And I remember in my own life, I was driving down to Fort Sand every summer, first to learn about writing fiction and then to teach writing fiction at the Summer School of the Arts. A wonderful place, an evocative place where thousands of people had died because it was a tuberculosis hospital before then, a mustard gas hospital. And so if ever there were ghosts in Saskatchewan, they'd be there, yeah. And once I picked up a young woman on the highway with a dog, and I tried to take her to a place where she could get home on the bus. But the bus driver wouldn't allow dogs on the bus. Okay. It was time for me to go teaching, so there she was stranded, having to hitchhike all the way back to Saskatoon. And I always felt badly about that. And so all of these thoughts came together. This awful drunk, not an unintelligent man, but a man who's missing some obvious stuff in life, lacking in wisdom. And so I brought them together so they would have this ill-fated affair. And then again, a sort of dark world unfolded that I hadn't planned to write about. The four horsemen of the apocalypse show up.
That's right.
Yeah, and they rape and kill Lola, and Ham has to live with the consequences of that. And it plunges him more deeply into alcoholism. What's the maker of Scotch?
Is it Dewar's?
Dewar's, no, it's another one. There's a
big extended kind of almost hallucinatory section about that.
That's right, yeah.
Is it Johnny Walker?
Johnny Walker, yes. Yeah. So in one of his drunken hallucinations, Johnny Walker shows up in Ham's bedroom at Fort Sand, and he comes to realize that Johnny Walker is the devil. Anyway, it's a dark epiphany, and he has to find his way out of this awful despair and come to terms with his life, the great failures in his life, the great tragedy of his daughter Anne falling off the top of a car when she was a baby. And the person who helps him do this is Lena Rotsol.
Fascinating character.
Lena Rotsol is from Poland, and she too has had a great tragedy in her life. And she's a wise woman. She's no pushover. She's not going to let Ham Walmsley off easily, but she listens to him. She hears his story and exchanges with him her own darkest story. And she gives him holy hell because he has ways of ducking out of his responsibilities or ducking out of his nightmare. He tries to joke his way out of situations. And although he's a bright man, he's also a deluded man. And it's almost as though her kind of tough Polish love has some
Can we say tough Polish lesbian love?
Yeah, tough Polish lesbian love. Nothing like it.
Nothing like it.
I think she had a great impact on him.
Absolutely.
And he had probably a more mature relationship with Lena Rotsol than he has had with anybody else in his life.
How did she come to you? Where did she come from, that character?
I can only tell you partly where she came from. I used to know a Polish writer in Saskatchewan who moved to the West Coast. And my first attempts at writing were on the West Coast, so I got to know her quite well. And she would tell me things about Polish women.
Okay.
She was a good raconteur and a good poet, too. So I carried her around in my memory as though she were a character. Now, she's nothing like Lena Rotsol. Lena Rotsol came up through life toughened by various things that happened to her in Poland and her affair with Yubisa Turpinowicz, And she was much better equipped to face life than Ham Walmsley, who drinks his way around it. And so where else could she have come? This was the time of the Polish workers' strike.
Solidarity, yes.
Yes, and there was a lot of Polishness in the news. And I tended to side with the strikers and find them very courageous. So out of that mishmash came Lena Rotsol. And it's probably not always an advisable thing to bring a major character into a novella when it's halfway finished. But I felt rather
You
bold.
pulled it off. Absolutely. This is not so much about Lena as it is about the drinking. This is one of my favorite sentences, just such a beautiful sentence. Whiskey should sink slow into the belly, lighting candles on the way down. Love that.
It's been so long since I wrote this that I'm surprised that I wrote that sentence.
Well, one of, would you call it Ham Walmsley's mottos or little sayings about philosophical things? We choose our prisons because they're safe, and spend the rest of our lives planning escapes.
Yeah, he uses the word we, but he's really talking about I. He was talking about himself. And perhaps in that era, it's the 70s. The 70s was a kind of free love era. And perhaps he assumed that a lot of other men thought that way. The need for love and intimacy and the impossibility of sustaining it. And I wrote this when I was a bachelor, so I hadn't yet been converted to the possibility that marriage could be a good thing. And then I met the love of my life, and there she is. And
I have to say I'm relieved because what's the wife's name in this one, the jokes?
Alice.
Alice. That Alice was not based on Honor Kiever. She's an artist.
Not even close.
I'm relieved to hear that.
Yeah.
I couldn't picture it myself.
And my wife Honor is a very distinguished artist.
Absolutely.
With a penetrating vision. And her paintings have this power to make you feel uneasy, and you don't always know why. But she doesn't paint pink mountains.
We featured some of Honor Kiever's art in the last video that I put up.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. So people have seen it. Okay, then I think my last question for you, David Carpenter, is how many Canadians does it take to screw in a light bulb?
God knows I've pondered that question all my life without an answer.
You haven't figured it out yet.
No.
That's the last line of the book, and that's maybe I'm not quite done asking you questions. Where I would go next is, These novellas, this work of literary fiction that is enigmatically connected one novella to the other, there's such a play of darkness and light and humor and beautiful nature writing and really dark experience and deep psychological wounds that are either being avoided or getting healed. Is that your thing as a writer of fiction? Those blends of tones and themes?
I think that's a good, if you were to write a learned tome, that would be a good way to start off. Very good way to start off. Yeah. Also, I might add that, especially Jokes of the Apocalypse, that novella, I wrote it consciously as a Canadian. And so there's a kind of Polish old world view, and there's a more naive, chirpy view of life going on. It's almost as though Canadians are ignorant of history, or at least I could see that was certainly so in the 70s.
That's an interesting thing. Now I want to reread it for that.
Be my guest.
Yes. Dave, thanks so much for talking to us about Jokes for the Apocalypse, which you should all go out and, I don't think it's in print, but you can certainly find used copies of.
Yes.
You need to bring it back into print.
I have several kilograms of Jokes for the Apocalypse, I believe, in my basement.
Yes, so you can find it one way or the other. Thanks so much, Dave.
You're very welcome.